Hey everyone, Evan Kirstel, super excited to chat today. It's not often you get a star on the show, but we have Star CIO today. Isaac, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Evan.
Well, thanks for being here. One of my favorite accounts on social media to follow, tons of inspiration and insight. You have so much to say about the world of digital transformation and beyond. For the folks who aren't familiar with your body of work, maybe introduce yourself and your mission these days.
Oh, that's a great way to ask the question. I've been in the seat of being a CTO and a CIO for 20 years before I sort of embarked on my own company, StarCIO. We help companies essentially develop digital transformation core competencies. It's really a follow through from my two books, Driving Digital, which is a practice book, Digital Trailblazer, that came out last year, is really a leadership book. And those two books, the impetus for this is 18 years of blogging and speaking all the way back to my startup days in 2005. And Evan, you know this already. I celebrated my 1,000th blog post and article this week. And
Mazel
my
tov.
mission
That's
is,
wonderful.
yeah, thank
That's
you.
quite a milestone, rather.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you kind of add it up. Uh, but yes, my mission. My mission is, I think every company needs to have technology, data, and now AI as a strategic advantage. Be able to build experiences up, use data for making faster and smarter decision making. And I'm here to help organizations do that. And I also do a lot of work with technology companies to make sure that digital trailblazers know about what's really special about their technology. So, do a lot of work in writing and speaking, do workshops, really try to spread my knowledge across a whole wide area of domains around digital transformation.
And you've done so much over your career, CTO, in many different startups, transformational CIO roles in different enterprises and industries. How has your, sort of leadership style and how has thinking evolved over the course of your long career? What are some of the highlights?
Here's how I'd answer that. I mean, I've always or rooted my leadership style in agile practices.
Hmm.
How do you bring teams together, focus them on a big picture mission, a real grand area to expand a business capability? Then how do you ground them in planning and then delivering in short chunks? How do you bring multidisciplinary teams together? How do you make agile beyond just a technology function? It's really a technology, business, and data function. So how do you bring everybody involved with that? How do you move that up stack, at least at the organizational level, and talk about what outcomes you're trying to influence, what markets and customers you want to build products against, and ultimately, what I believe is that every organization every 2 to 3 years has to rewrite their playbook. There's too much technology change, customer experiences change. That to me is what digital transformation is all about, is looking at the business through the lens of technology and saying, what do I need to be prepared to do differently because the competitive forces are out there and my markets are changing. So that's how I see the world. I think a lot of what I do is bring focus and prioritization to what people are trying to do. It's very easy to say, we're going to go do digital transformation. We're, got 100 people in IT. We're going to go prioritize 150 initiatives and
Mm.
make sure we get them all done in 2024. So obviously that's not realistic, but you see a lot of organizations try to do things like that. And prioritize the kitchen sink. And I come in and say, let's talk about what's most important. Let's make sure we staff it correctly, make sure we have the resources on it, and then sort of build up from the ground up in terms of priorities. And then I get very interested in areas like how do you democratize data? How do you bring data technologies
Mm.
outside of IT into business units? I get involved in low code and no code technologies, what I call proactive data governance. How do you bring business teams on par with the capability of low code and self-service technologies, but also elevate your ability to improve data governance in parallel to that. So I do a lot of that kind of work. And then probably the most important thing I would say is, bring product management type capabilities in organizations that never had them before. So what you see, once you get into an initiative, um, there's a lot of, here's our to-do list. Here's our priority list of 30 things. You put a project manager or a scrum master or whatever you call it on top of it, and you just go down that pecking order, and you look at it after 6 months, and you ask the question, did we really move the needle by doing all these improvements? And you find out maybe not. And so, I've worked with a lot of companies on how do you bring product management disciplines, look at voice of customers, do some design thinking exercises, and saying, how do we not just take a funnel of everybody's wish list, but really think strategically about what we're investing in.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. Well said. So
Thank
driving
you.
driving digital, I love this idea of a playbook for digital transformation. It's been out for a while now. So do you have any success stories or insights or anecdotes on how companies really applied your strategies in their environments?
Yeah, I mean, that book came out in 2017, and when I wrote it, I was thinking it was late to the game. I didn't realize that there's going to be years of more companies trying to learn how to implement transformation programs. And why I call it a playbook, it's not linear. It's every
Mm,
organization has different challenges and opportunities. They're coming in with some things that they're really skilled at, some things they have to learn. And so, when you read it as a book, it looks, it starts with agile, it goes into DevOps, it goes into portfolio, and then product management and culture change. But, every organization I walk into is a little bit different. So I walk into a cloud native organization,
mm,
built up their stack over the last 3 years, maybe 5 years now, and they're very focused on DevOps, right? How do we really
mm,
create automation? How do we create pipelines? How do we continue the velocity of development now that they have a lot of SaaS company, thousands of users using this thing? They don't want operations to slow them down. So it's a very different sort of transformation story around DevOps than say another company that's stuck on a lot of legacy platforms, doesn't do a lot of development at all.
mm,
They're going to do a lot of modernizations through SaaS. But you know what? They have some mission critical localized applications. They're going to run in their data center for latency purposes. It needs to be highly secure. And they need to create day two models that work with lots of different vendors and lots of different constituents. You start bringing this together and say, what is the architecture? What is the development plan? What's the support plan to make something like this more accurate? So, I was very, had a lot of foresight in driving digital. I said, look, this is the playbook, but it's not a Bible. It's not, this is
mm.
what you need to do. This is a collection, it's a guide. And what you really need to do is think through how to pick and pull what's, a best practice from not just my writing, but from others, and say, we're going to bring a team together and say, what are we doing that's standard in our practice? What is an emerging standard that we're testing? And where are we going to be completely self-organizing, right? Where there's no point in creating a standard. We're going to allow teams to figure this out on their own and then maybe look to create a standard later on. So that's really the heart of what driving digital is all about. And a big heart of what I've been doing since then, since 2017, is helping organizations figure that out.
Brilliant. So on your blog, you cover such a wide variety of topics with 1,000 issues. Obviously, that's going to be the case.
Mhm.
Any emerging technologies on your personal radar that you're most excited about for the next near-term period of time that's going to have the biggest impact for enterprise?
Well, I wrote an article a couple months ago for CIO about the
Mhm,
impact of Gen AI. So
mhm,
that's the easy one, sort of the softball to get out of that. But there's a nuance here. Like, if I think digital transformation, every couple years there's a major milestone, whether it's a pandemic or 2022, sort of like a recession. Now it's the AI transformation. So I think every couple years CIOs need to look at what's facing their organization, opportunities and risks. And right now, there's this thing called Gen AI, And, on one side of the extreme are the boards and CEOs that are scared, that they don't want to be falling behind. They want competitive advantage. They want productivity out of it. They don't truly understand the risks. They just are enamored by the technology and what we're all writing about it. And on the bottom side is every employee wanting to play with one of the hundreds of tools out there and seeing what they can do with it. And
Mm,
so it's sort of like back to the days of mobile and when the app stores came out, where there was this consumerization of IT, right? We have all this technology capability at our fingertips. And back then, CIOs are pretty conservative, and they said no to a lot of things, and they locked things down. I don't think that strategy fully works here. I think, the CIO needs an AI strategy that says we're going to focus on these problems in these departments. We're going to experiment with these tools. We're going to create ideation phases so we can learn from what's working, what's not working. And, they need a long-term play, depending on the industry. If you're in healthcare, financial services, if you're in book publishing or
mm,
education, any of these industries are going to have prompt engines living on top of proprietary IP, changing the customer experience and the employee experience around it. It's early days now, so if you want to go play in these areas, you're going to have to do a little bit more heavy lifting and learning and have skills to do that. But over the next 2 or 3 years, I see this becoming a little bit mainstream. So Gen AI is sort of the easy low hanging fruit there. I think there's byproducts of that,
mhm.
right? So when I think about a software developer's experience today, we went from IDE from notepads to IDEs, right, to full boat DevOps platforms that give us all the automation behind it. And we were stuck with a ton of technical debt. We made it really easy for developers to build code, to deploy code. We're still not in the best set of practices and tools to say, how do we reuse code, right? The mechanisms are out there, but the average developer is more interested in building code. That's what they get paid for. So they build a lot of code. And so now you have co-pilots out there, and the co-pilots are still relatively primitive. But I'm looking at the idea 2 years down the road where the average developer is going to prompt and say, tell me what libraries to look at within my corpus, within sanctioned open source, that allows me to start doing development with code that already exists, go through a code review process, and then figure out how to assemble that code rather than from building from scratch as the de facto standard. So I think you're going to see a lot of things like that play out where the world is changing in little micro areas. I've done some writing and speaking around this too. You go to the average enterprise, how many different keyword based search engines are working behind the enterprise? It's built into every single tool. There's probably
Mm.
several different platforms, content management systems out there. As an employee, I want to prompt, and I don't care if the data is in the CRM or the ERP or the database, wherever it is. I want to be able to prompt to get some answers and get, who should I talk to about this? And, I think we're going to see another wave of AI generated prompt searching that impacts larger organizations. So I think that's going to be a big island that has lots of little islands that come off of it. I think that's going to be the big story of 2024. I think everything else is going to get dwarfed. I think the other big story is going to be around, how do we get better at security? And I'm
Mm.
not a security expert, but the more I dive into it, the more the to-do list grows faster than where I can shore up holes. And again, the same problem. We can't slow businesses down by putting locks on the doors and locks on the networks. Our networks have to function. We need to be able to deploy. And now we're starting to look at, again, machine learning, AI based automations that are now part of our security stack, and saying, tell me where I have a problem and what to do about it.
Yeah, scary time to be a CISO and
Yeah.
exciting time as well. The flip side, so much to watch there. In your work, you emphasize agile ways of working. It's a big theme for companies who haven't gone down the agile route. What's the baby step? What are the first steps to kind of adopt a more agile mindset or approach to their business?
Yeah, I mean, basics of agile are often confused with tools and
Hmm.
rituals, and those become clearly important. But I just get people starting to think in bite-sized chunks of work. Let's talk about what we're trying to accomplish in the next couple of weeks. Let's just say couple of weeks is a sprint for a better word. Remove the jargon as much as you can, and getting people to the idea of we're going to forecast what we think we can do in the next couple of weeks,
Mm.
getting used to committing to it, and then having a conversation after it about what went well and what didn't go well with that sprint. So I
Yeah.
really believe in starting with real fundamentals about what agile is supposed to do before you get into all the rituals and nuances around it. You slowly introduce that. I think, the other part to this, I'll give you two other nuances. 10, 15 years ago, the big story in Agile was how do we go from no process or waterfall into an Agile process or an Agile mindset? There's still a lot of companies doing that, but I think the bigger story is you bring, 10, 100, 1,000 people together, not just dev, but now dev and ops and hopefully business as part of that. And you say the word agile, and it's like the Tower of Babel. I mean, there's going to be this people who are talking safe. There's going to be people talking squads and the Spotify framework. There's going to be, there's about 30 different frameworks out there, and people get pretty religious about them. So you bring them into the organization and you say, what agile are we figuring out for this organization? And my advice to CIOs, anybody doing this, is that's your job to figure out. Don't take my playbook or Safe's playbook or anybody else's playbook as a framework that you have to follow completely. Bring those as tools in and say what makes sense for our organization. And some organizations are able to staff a scrum master for every single team. Most can't. Some have business analysts doing story writing. Some have
Mm.
really good product owners doing story writing. So now you're
Mm.
really starting answering the question of like, how do I take a process that we know largely works and say, given my skill, my staff, how are we designing it over here? So that's number two. Is I think every organization really has to think about maturing their model and defining their model based on what they're trying to accomplish and where their starting points are. And I would say the third thing is, and I feel like this is the dark area for most agile programs,
Mm.
is uh, they really start from this notion of a backlog, and that there's this notion of a product owner who knows how to be a product owner. And in most organizations, that's just simply not the case. There's an entire world of going from an idea to whether it's worth investing in that idea, to
Mm.
how you do some initial planning around that year, the entire sort of product management discipline, or in some organizations, it's a design thinking discipline. In some organizations, it's a Six Sigma analysis, or other business process analysis that's doing all the upstream work and saying, here's what we do today. Here's what our customers want. Here's why it's important. Here's how we start stringing a backlog against this. It often gets lost in the same way that, the nuances of agile get lost. So, figuring out what stakeholder means and defining that responsibility, figuring out are you got product managers or product owners, and fully empowering them to come up with what the roadmap is, what are the KPIs we're trying to address with our programs. And then, having the right collaboration between a product owner and their team saying, product owner can't come up and say scope and timeline. We know that doesn't work. I
Mm.
tell product owner, you help my team understand the scope, the customer, the why, the problem statement. Try to steer a little bit out of the solution, give the team time to solution, question the team on their solutions, make sure they give you trade offs. And I tell the team, look, you need to come back and start getting good at forecasting and giving those trade-offs, but also forecasting your timeline. Given what we know, we think this is 5 stories, 100 points, 2 sprints, whatever you end up doing it. But give some feedback back to that product owner so they can say, I want to do more of this stuff, or maybe shrink the scope down. So those are three very fundamental things that I talk about it in the book. They're part of my programs. They got kind of left out. Either they get very regimental in some programs, or they kind of get left out in other programs. And my message is, you know, whether you do this with me or anybody else, figure out what your agile way of working should look like and how to prioritize improvements based on what you're trying to accomplish.
Well, really well said. And kind of building on that, you talk a lot about the importance of being a data-driven organization. Easier said than done. There's so many cultural challenges there for businesses looking to be truly data centric. Any advice there? What's the old quote? Strategy, culture eats strategy for breakfast, but maybe culture eats data for breakfast too. Um,
Yeah.
we've all worked for companies that, it's just so hard to overcome that culture of gut feel and decision making around feelings or beliefs. What say you?
I would say this. There's a number of tools here um, that it's part of a journey to become data driven.
Hmm.
Some of it is very technical, right? Where are your data sources, how you're automating data integrations and pipelines around it, how you're starting to implement data quality. So there's a lot of nuances on the technology side, but I really look at it from an end user perspective first. And on the bottom side of it, we have generations of people that if they're using data, it basically means spreadsheets, and they're borrowing and they're pulling data from different places. They're doing their curmudgeoning in a spreadsheet, they're copying the results into a PowerPoint, and you're looking at this and saying, how did you get from point A to point B? And you have no idea, right? And so there's some disciplines in there. I tell people, show me the data, right? Tell me where this data comes from. If you're going to put it into a story in a PowerPoint, make sure you give me references. Something the AIs aren't doing very well right now, but
Mm.
tell me where your data sources are. And I'm leading them down a path of getting away from a lot of the manual data prep that they're doing to let's look at some tools that can build data products. We're going to build dashboards, or you're going to commission
Mm.
a data science team to build a model for you. But let's get away from one-off type of exercises and saying, what do you need as tools and processes and decision making to do decisions more regularly, um, do it with fresher data, more accurate data, and bring them that into that world where we have all these capabilities, but they have to be a partner in creating them. Same thing on the executive side. I tell this story in Digital Trailblazer. Executives have the same problem.
Hmm.
They sort of want their answers either handed to them, or they don't want answers at all, right? They just want to use their intuition. They've built up 20, 30 years experience around it. Um, and so, one of the ways I test CEOs to see if they're really ready to be data driven is I say, let's talk about setting up some of your leadership team meetings where PowerPoints and spreadsheets are not allowed. We're going to go pick some domain to do our analysis. It might be profitability about a business. It might be about sales pipeline. We're going to bring in some tool experts that know how to use the ERP or know how to use the CRM or whatever tools you're using. Bring them in. We're going to tell them what some of the questions are up front, so they're not, trying to do reporting on the fly, but they're going to have to answer our questions with reports straight out of our systems. And they're going to have to show us what it's like when we have a follow-up questions, what they have to do to try to get an answer around that. And you get a lot of very interesting things that come out of that. First is you start seeing often how bad the data is. The pipeline says
Mm.
that growth is 15%, and the head of sales looks at it and says, I don't buy that. And say, well, who owns that data? Right? You own that data. Why are you saying it's 15% growth if you don't believe it? Right? And
Right.
so that gets into the whole sales operation side of things. So you get, now you start getting into data owners, getting into the actual business process around this. You start seeing where your tools are. The CFO that wants to build all the reporting out of your ERP system and do everything natively there, and stuck trying to bring all this data into the ERP, and you're seeing A lot of the platforms today, they've abandoned their reporting engines, or they've built separate analytics platforms, or there are separate analytics platforms they interface with. So, a lot of companies are still stuck in the antiquated reporting tools that are built into their platforms that have siloed data sets that don't have the best user experience. Now you bring your expert in, and they're doing sort of the travel agent hands on keyboard trying to get an answer around something, and it doesn't look good. And the CIO should be sitting there and saying, "Look, we got to talk about different, better ways of doing this because I got three experts who know my ERP and maybe four who know about my CRM, and that's not going to work for us to become data driven." So that's a top-down exercise. I think every CIO and organization. It's a little risky, right?
Mhm.
A lot of things can go wrong with that. So take some practice to figure out how to do it. But I tell that story in Digital Trailblazer.
I love that. You also have written extensively on the low code revolution, no code
Yeah.
revolution. And such an exciting time there. I heard a joke, someone talking about English being the hot new programming language. It's a little, we're not quite there yet, but what are some of the misconceptions about low code platforms that businesses and others should be aware of as they embark down this journey?
Yeah, it's a great question because I mean, look, low code, no code has actually been around for 20 plus years.
Mm,
The first one that I deployed was in 2001 or two, and my problem statement was we just had gone through a recession, or we were in a recession. I had to shift how I was using IT. I needed to build up some in-house tools, but I had most of my development team building customer facing. So I couldn't use Java developers to go build inside tools and employee experiences and apps. I said I need a better way of doing this, and I discovered a no-code tool and said, "Here's a tool we can go do a lot of apps with and get
mm,
off of spreadsheets." So they number one misnomer, they've been around for a very long time. Um, Number two is really truly understand the difference between no and low code. Low code is going to give you a lot more capability. Um, that but it's essentially a productivity tool for developers, right? You are
mm,
going to have to staff developers using that particular tool, learning that vernacular, understanding how to use it in a more productive way than JavaScript, .NET, Java, whatever your framework is. So you're looking at productivity, you're looking at ease of use and experience, and saying, is this platform helping us build and enhance apps with higher productivity, with more frequency than if I do it yourself? And that's a low code story. And the no code story is very, very different, right? No code is basically saying, I'm starting to shift some of my responsibilities outside of IT into the world of business. There are people in business groups, particularly marketing, but I find them in operations and finance. They graduate college with technical acumen and interest, but no interest in being in IT. And they're saying, you know what? I'd like to try building an app or an integration or a dashboard. And if you give me the tools, or the salesperson sells them to tool without IT's involvement, which has been
mm.
happening a number of years, right? Um, I will go figure this all out. And, there's been a lot of success with a lot of platforms, not just one, being able to do that. And the misnomer here is I could do no code without IT's involvement. It doesn't mean IT isn't involved um, in the coding. A lot of no code can be done without IT coding, but tell me a business group that understands what versioning means. That you version your applications and you put release notes out. That if you're creating a database behind it, that you're creating a data dictionary around it, that you're thinking about user acceptance testing, all those sort of practices that make an SDLC work are still very relevant in some cases around no code. But our business users have never been through that experience. So there's what IT will call governance question here that CIOs have to step into. It's a lot of education more than anything
Mhm.
else. And when you put that together, you get tremendous productivity. I mean, I built customer facing product out of no code. I've transformed, you take, you know, a company that's, 100, 200 legacy applications, and some portion should go to SaaS and stay in that box. and some portion is going to end up being in low and no code. And you should today be in a relatively small percentage of saying, I really need a homegrown app over here. Let's figure out how to go build this. This is your average enterprise, right? This is your average mid-sized company that has to pick and choose where they're really going to truly build something from scratch versus I got a lot more options out there today.
Wow, fascinating. So you talk to so many organizations and business leaders and technology leaders. What are
Mm.
some of the maybe softer challenges that they're seeing with their organizations? Maybe it's flexible work. Is it human capital challenges, hiring challenges? There's really a lot of change and chaos ahead of us. And what are they telling you about overcoming some of these challenges?
Well, I'll boil it down for two for you. I think the one is the sort of talent, skill, leadership
Mm,
talent issue. That's been around for quite some time.
mm,
It's sort of been ebbed down as some companies have shed some talent recently. But when I talk to leadership in particular, and I say, what should CIOs, what should CDOs, digital and data officers, maybe even some of their direct reports, if you have a large organization, what should they really be focusing on? If you take their time, that time should be focused on colleagues, business leaders, customers, markets, board, right? If you take a 40 or 50-hour work week, somewhere between 50 and 75% needs to be in that corner and saying, where is this business going? And how do I get my business teams aligned on priorities, on vision, on funding models, on where we're getting impacts? It takes a tremendous amount of work to do that. And so then when you get into all the driving digital practices, right? Talk about
mm,
agile, talk about DevOps, moving to the cloud, becoming data driven, all those things that we have to build as a new digital platform, a new operating model, shed some legacy platforms, get to real platforms, experiment. We need lieutenants to do that. I mean, that's the
mm,
essence of the Digital Trailblazer book is a digital trailblazer is somebody who's going to come in and run a digital transformation initiative. And so when people ask me like how many different initiatives can we really fit under our portfolio, and I say to them, how many digital trailblazers do you have to be able to lead them? And if you have three, maybe you can have three or four executing and maybe one or two in planning, but at some point you're going to run out of leadership bandwidth.
mm,
And if you don't have leaders leading these programs, they're not going to get anywhere. They're going to look like technology projects.
mhm,
So I think the very first thing is, yes, there's a skill problem. Okay. Um, but I think there's a bigger leadership problem, particularly coming out of the pandemic years, particularly that we have to move transformation initiatives so fast, in particular because we're still sort of dealing with whether you're fully remote or hybrid or on site. We haven't had people working together in a cohesive way for 4 years now,
mm.
3, 4 years now. So that to me, the leadership problem is a big one that they're all feeling and how to get people to step and lead these initiative programs. And I think the other one still is around hybrid work. Okay. I know there's some companies that are truly trying to get people back into the office. My answer to them is good luck with that. Um, you know, uh, Look, there's some companies, that are in industries that have very physical presence, manufacturing, retail, and it's a little bit more challenging to say, the information workers can be fully hybrid, and everybody else has to be back in their physical spaces. So I get that piece of it, but when I look at most organizations that are doing data and technology work, um, to me, this is about, collaboration, productivity, brainstorming, and again, I think every company has to have a slightly different model in terms of how you set expectations, what tools you're using, and there's some good data on this, but it's not perfect data. And I think CIOs have to step in and say, you know what, if we're going to make hybrid working work in our company, here's version 1.0, or maybe we're up to 3.0 now. Here's version 3.0 of what this is going to look like. Here's how we're using these tools. Here's what your expectations are. And, we say back in office, here's the parameters of how we want people to operate when they're back in office. Right now, it's sort of very black and white. We want you in the office X days of week.
Mm,
Employees aren't happy. I don't think the employer is getting the productivity they expect out of it. It's sort of a brute force approach. If you say something like, you know what, we're going to create 10 days a month or 10 days a quarter, let's say, where we want collaborative work happening in every department. And we want a plan from every department leader to say, how are they going to fulfill that? And so, IT that's in two different locations on the East Coast may have a very different way of handling that than sales that has 200 people spread across 20 different states. But those 10 days that they're collaborating together in face to face is going to be far better than saying that they should be in the office 1 day a week for 10 weeks.
mm. Wow, really,
I'm
it's a
opinionated
really
there, but
useful.
I
Yes, you have a few, which that's a really interesting insight there. And what about advice career-wise to those digital trailblazers, the next generation of CIOs, tech leaders, et cetera? What should they be doing personally, professionally to prepare themselves for the sort of next wave of their career?
yeah, it's a great question. Two things come to mind. Number one, really subscribe to the idea of lifelong learning.
Mm,
I run a relatively small business in sprints that are 1 week long. So I drink my own Kool-Aid, and in there every single week is at least one learning exercise. So, you want to build muscle memory, you want to get shape. What do? You create a regiment that works for you and an approach that works for you. I think that's really important for every individual to think what that means for them, whether that means courses or reading books or attending conferences. I think some of it needs to be physical, in-person engagement. But I think subscribing to this idea of lifelong learning is very important. I think the other is getting out of your comfort zone. And what I mean by that, I talk about that also in Digital Trailblazer. There's a certain amount of work you have to do to build proficiency in your discipline. I'm a product manager, I'm a UX designer, I'm a software developer. There's a lot of work, particularly in the first 5 to 10 years of your career, to go from I'm sort of figuring this stuff out to I have command over some things, I have comfort over some things, and if I don't understand it, I probably can figure this out. So you get to that sort of 5 to 10 year point of your career, but now transformation programs again, they're formed by bringing people of multiple disciplines together to act collaboratively. And the only way you're going to really understand how to do that is start learning other disciplines, learning depth of your skill set and then breadth of how do you partner with the other skill sets and what they need to do. So I think it's both of those two things. I will say this, Evan, I do put a checklist out. I have what I call a digital trailblazer checklist. If you go to starcio.com, you could look under tools. You'll see career checklist. There's a version for product manager, one for DevOps, and one for data
mm.
groups. You get a nice PDF, and it says, here's how you think about navigating your career. So if you have a question around that, I think that's a really good resource to go after. And honestly, that's essentially what Digital Trailblazer is all about. I wrote a book that's a first person narrative. If you liked the Phoenix Project, sort of 80-90% storytelling, and then maybe 10 to 20% lessons. Mine's a little different. So it's not fiction, it's real stories. It's not linear. I jump across my career. It's raw at times in terms of the language I'm using. It gets professional as it goes on. I take on some real leadership topics toward the end, some real nut and bolts topics in the beginning. And then I leave 50 lessons learned for the reader simply because, there's certain things you can't learn until you're faced with the experience. And so I put people sitting next to me saying, this is what it was like in one of my first board meetings when somebody asked me, one of our board members asked me, Isaac, what's a cookie? And my CEO is like, better not go down the jargon sphere and trying to answer that. So I described my stress in trying to answer that for a board meeting.
I
So
love
those
that.
two things, lifelong learning and really spread and really understand the disciplines that you collaborate with.
And I would add, emulate what you're doing on social and digital channels. You're out there, you're writing, you're tweeting and posting, and It can be a really
as well as you.
tremendous.
Yeah,
Well,
you're doing
I
it too.
wouldn't suggest anyone emulate me. I'm a kind of fanatic, but just putting yourself out there can be very career advancing and create really interesting connections. Even
Yes.
after you discount all the noise and nonsense on social, there's a great community to tap into. So what are
Yes.
you up to the rest of the year? I know you do 50, 60, 100 events a year, something like that. What's on the radar before the end of the year?
Yeah, I have a couple more events before the end of the year. I think there's an event in Phoenix that I'm doing a keynote event for a company called Sync. That one will probably be some version of AI and digital transformation. I do a coffee hour on LinkedIn. It's the easiest way to actually
Oh, wow.
engage with me. Yeah, so they have this LinkedIn audio event that I started,
Right, right.
sort of like Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces, but on LinkedIn. It's audio only. You can join and just listen. You can join it and raise your hand and come up and speak. So it's very much like AM radio with that ability to come up on stage. I
Now
do it
you're
every
dating
Friday.
yourself. That's yes,
Yeah,
AM radio.
but
Yeah.
there was something really good about AM radio when it was done well. But 11 a.m. Fridays, almost every week. This week we're talking about the human side of AI, and
Hmm.
the URL to that is starcio.com/coffee/next dash event. That will redirect you to the next week's LinkedIn page where you can sign up for the event. So a couple things that are doing there. I'm always creating more content. There's a piece of content we collaborated on at that coffee hour called the 50 Attributes of Digital Trailblazers.
Hmm.
I have a couple of blog posts and a couple of YouTube videos around this, but I haven't released the full list yet. That's going to come out in January.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations
Thank you.
again on the sorry, 1,000 blog posts.
Thousand.
That's,
Thank you.
and look forward to the next 1,000. And thanks for joining. I appreciate the
Evan, thanks
quality
for having
time
me.
here. Yeah, thanks
Uh,
everyone for watching. Reach out on Twitter X if you're still there. It's really fun following Isaac at StarCIO as well as all the various LinkedIn destinations. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Evan. Thanks, everyone.